Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which every year I do this show is wrapped in sort of more layers of complexity, uncertainty, and dispute. And here we are in a political moment, unlike really unlike anything else, certainly in my 69 years. um, And that leads to so many questions on so many levels. And it's great to have Sean Casten, who's a representative of the 6th District in Illinois since 2019, back on the show. I think this is your third time. It might be four. I can't remember.
Whatever it is not enough, Andy.
Well, thank you. To offer us a little bit of a perspective from a congressman who is in the heartland and who has been very focused even before he was in Congress on climate and energy, and who is very upset right now if you track his social media about what's happened with the Trump regime. So it's really a vital time to hear from people like you about several layers. One of which, the first one, the highest layer, is democracy itself and the American system of government. The second layer would be related to issues of sustainability, climate resilience, and climate and energy transition. And we can go down the list from there. I thought I'd start with just how do you get through your weeks? We're all dealing with overload with the sense of the zone flooding, which is an express strategy of Trump and his minions to get us overwhelmed, to have so many executive orders coming. He's running out of ink in his Sharpies and keep everyone playing catch up, including the Supreme Court. So when you wake up in the morning on a Monday or here on a Friday, how do you stay sane? What's the way you function? And then we'll get into some of these details. And thanks.
Well, thanks for having me again, Andy. It's funny. I was just having this conversation with a new member, Maggie Goodlander, who's probably just adjacent to you over there in New Hampshire, and who's a very good, really very smart new member. But we were having this exact conversation, and we were sort of realizing as we talked to each other that if you are as close to the problem as we are, and you understand what's going on, and you are not in the seat we're in, it would be panic-inducing and paralyzing. Being in a position to fight back, it is the man in the ring who matters, as Teddy Roosevelt said, is where the I don't want to say joy, but where the work satisfaction comes from. We could be ignorant and happy, or knowledgeable and panicked, or knowledgeable and acting. And if those are the only three choices, I'm at least happy to be in door three. On a somewhat lighter note, when my dad asked me recently how my mental space was, I said, you learn things about yourself in moments like these, and the two things I've learned about myself is that, number one, I hate Nazis a lot more than I thought I did. And I really did think I hated them. And number two, I enjoy fighting them a lot more than I thought I would.
And did you ever think you would have to fight something so profoundly terrible in this day and age?
Categorically, no. I think back a lot to, it was in a different context, but after George Floyd's killing, we were sitting there in caucus one day and talking about what to do next. And John Lewis, who was still with us at that point, stood up and he said, "I thought we were done with this." It's the only time I ever heard John be anything but optimistic. And in his typical John way, like, he paused a beat and then he said, "I've also been never more optimistic than I am right now, because I've never seen so many people marching who don't look like me."
That's
And
interesting.
John was masterful at finding the silver lining. And and I think there is some silver lining here that, forget about the last election results for a moment. Most people hate Donald Trump. He does not keep friends. The people he surrounds himself with are some combination of morons, cowards, and sycophants. People do not stay with him. They go to the jail after with him. You can always break things quicker than you can build them.
Right.
But he has never been someone who follows the first rule of politics is that is to grow by addition. and he is sustained by division, and that's really dangerous. But I also take some optimism from the fact that the majority of Americans did not vote for Trump. I think if the election was today, they wouldn't vote for him. The things that we knew he was going to do and told people he was going to do, namely Project 2025, he ran away from because they're really unpopular. And so, regardless of how your neighbors may have voted, I think we can all take some solace in the fact that most people do not share Donald Trump's values. Somehow we have to find a way through this in spite of that, because of the way that our power structures are set up, because of the cowardice and the sycophancy that is Mike Johnson, that is John Thune, that is the entire Republican caucus. And we just have to keep reminding people that, what the stakes of this moment are, that there is no guarantee that we will win if we fight, but there's an absolute guarantee that we will lose if we don't.
And what's been your sense of the social sphere so far? The first April 5th demonstrations, and I guess on April 19th there's more. How do you feel that plays into the dynamics?
I was really encouraged, and I feel like since the November election, we have gone. We, not all of us, but I think we, writ large, have moved from apathy to fear, from fear to anger, and now we're moving from anger into action. And you need to go through those stages of grief, but we're getting there. I was encouraged to see everybody, protesting, but I was also encouraged to see people protesting in a constructive way. Like there's plenty of things you could be angry at. I mean, you could go and you could have a protest and have signs next to each other that says, why are we violating due process? Why are we violating the Constitution? And also, why won't you do more Chuck Schumer, right? And yes, you can say all those things, but we have to understand that, on a scale of 1 to 1,000, there are things that are ones and there are things that are 1,000, and let's stay focused. And I think, in a very organic way, those protests were focused on the thousands, which felt appropriate.
Right. So I want to go back in time. So I think the last time you were on twice in 2022, which seems so long ago, so very long ago. And we were talking about permitting reform and how to get Democrats, including Manchin, aligned in ways that seemed impossible at that point. And with climate and energy, every day, every hour, you look online and there's some new action Trump is taking to try to forestall that dynamic toward cleaner energy and more. And then on the resilience side, they killed off FEMA's program, the BRIC program, which was this single biggest funding source for communities, many of them in rural red places, to get resources to bolster their preparedness ahead of a disaster, no matter what's causing it. So how big a change has this been? When you think about the situation then and now, what comes to mind? And there's some questions that are going to come in from the audience soon related to this.
So in some ways, I mean, it's different because the people who are on the wrong side of those issues are in greater positions of power than they were before. But I don't think the dynamics have fundamentally changed in the sense that there is no fundamental opposition from anyone in Washington to clean energy. And that may sound heretical, but stay with me.
Yep.
There's a huge opposition by a whole lot of people in Washington, including Joe Manchin, to cheap energy. And what scares the dickens out of people who represent those parts of the country where the economy has historically depended on oil, gas, and coal production is that they know they cannot compete in a market where renewables have access to a level playing field.
Right.
And so you've had this tension, and we saw it in the the permitting that we ultimately failed to do in the last Congress, that the Republican plan for permitting is entirely around building new oil and gas and coal export facilities and pipelines and rail to get those products to exportable markets, because all of those all of those fossil fuel commodities have been steadily losing market share to cheaper alternatives over the last decade. And that's not going to change because you can't change the laws of economics. You can slow it down. There is no support on the Republican side of the aisle for transmission because transmission connects low-cost energy to high-cost markets. And there is no, I don't think there's a strong voice in either caucus, but there's certainly no strong voice in the Republican caucus for competitive markets. I mean, think about the fact that, Ronald Reagan deregulated the airline industry, deregulated telecoms, and, Fred Kahn, who famously led the Civil Aviation Administration, said at the time that the process of deregulation requires shifts the regulatory responsibility from consumer protection to antitrust enforcement, and it fails when it does the former and doesn't do the latter. That's a very thoughtful, market-friendly approach, right? We now think of Lena Khan, who was basically trying to do the same thing as this far left person, even though the hymn book she was singing from sounds an awful lot like Fred Kahn's. No relation between the two. Certainly an ideological link. And so I think what we're seeing, now that you have the anti-market, anti-cheap energy voices ascended, and it's not just Trump. Like Doug Burgum and Chris Wright do not know how to make money in a competitive industry. They have made their money, made their billions in uncompetitive industries. Donald Trump does not know how to make money in a competitive market where the stakes aren't rigged. And hell, the guy couldn't even make money when the stakes were rigged. He did go bankrupt running a casino, right?
Right.
Mike Johnson, representing Louisiana, has an economy that depends on oil and gas production. His predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, was from Bakersfield High School, home of the Drillers.
Right.
And so like there used to be a point where if you were from an energy extractive part of the country, you were no more or less likely to have Republican or Democratic representation. If you were from an energy consumptive part of the country, you were no more likely. Now, if you're going to shift wealth from energy producers to energy consumers, you are almost invariably shifting wealth from red America to blue America. And that really has proven to be the difficulty with getting bipartisan legislation through, because putting consumers first is not bipartisan.
Right.
And that's a challenge. And the good news is we could do that. We were very intentionally in the Inflation Reduction Act about trying to make sure that we prioritized investments in those communities that were going to be left behind. The reason why you saw so much Inflation Reduction Act money flowing to red America was not because we were politically prioritizing red America, but because we were very intentionally saying we are all Americans. And if you're in a community where the coal mine is going to close, let's make sure you get first dibs at the new battery factory, right?
Right.
And it's the right thing to do, but that's what you do if you're pursuing the politics of addition.
Right. That brings to mind Costa Samaras, who had been in the administration, the Biden administration, and is back now at Carnegie Mellon.
Very smart.
He sent in some questions, and actually Kurt Newton is in the green room. I sent around a note, posted a query saying if you have questions, bring them on. So some of that will come on soon. But Costa was actually asking you about the Inflation Reduction Act, and have you felt much, maybe off the record, reaction or concern among the rural regions in the heartland about how this could affect their existing energy trends that have been enthusiastically supported in red places as well as blue places?
I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who are keenly aware of how much money has flowed to their districts and would like to keep them there.
Yeah.
I mean, just take as an example, Iowa has 2 Republican senators and 4 Republican members of Congress. If you got rid of wind and ethanol, that's really bad for Iowa. Right? Iowa does not have a ton of oil drilling, gas drilling, LNG export terminals last time I checked.
No. And no coal mining, hardly any left. There was some.
Exactly. And there's a lot of other parts of the country you're seeing that as well. I think the challenge you have is that at least at this moment, the elected Republicans in Washington fear Donald Trump far more than they fear their voters, and Republican leadership is generally not from Iowa, right?
Right.
And so, asking those folks to stand up and fight for their constituents is a hard lift right now, and not just on this issue, right? They're getting screamed at because Medicaid cuts are going to decimate rural America because it's going to destroy healthcare first and foremost in the lowest income parts of our country that don't have a lot of hospitals.
Right.
The cuts to the Veterans Affairs program are going to decimate, cause real pain to blocks of people that demographically have kind of skewed Republican. The reason they're not doing town halls right now is because they don't have good answers to their constituents. The reason why we saw such strong results in the April elections is because the constituents are fed up with the crap that they're selling. But so far, they are not ready to put those constituents first. But keep the pressure up, and maybe they will.
Yeah. Have you heard much coming from anyone on the red side? I was going to ask specifically about nuclear. You're in a state that has nuclear power, where there had been a trend toward getting some more nuclear power. And is that a wedge? I'm not sure if wedge is the right metaphor, but a possibility for an opening?
Oh, I mean, I think there's very bipartisan support for nuclear. We periodically have these off-hill dinners, bipartisan climate dinners, and that's always an area of some commonality. I had a very amusing conversation a year or two ago that we were at one of these, and we got to talking about SMRs and how to bring them forward, and how do we make sure that we get clean power, but also the benefits that baseload power bring. And at the end of the dinner, Representative Miller Meeks, also coincidentally from Iowa, came up to me and said, I'm so happy to hear that there are Democrats who support nuclear. And I laughed and I said, I'm so happy to hear there are Republicans who support socialism. Because I don't know how you build a nuclear plant without some federal guarantee, since no one has ever built a nuclear plant on time or on budget. So yes, we need them. But the reason why China, Russia, and France are the leading providers of nuclear energy is because they've never been particularly troubled by embracing socialism in their energy sector.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. I mean, look at the data. You can pull this up from there were a little over a decade between the first commissioned nuclear plant in the United States and 3 Mile Island. During that decade, we built 50 gigawatts of nuclear. Over the decade that followed 3 Mile Island, we built another 50 gigawatts of nuclear. There is zero evidence that 3 Mile Island and all of the resulting permitting in any way slowed down nuclear construction in the United States.
Right.
Once we got to 100, we stopped building all new nuclear. What happened a decade after 3 Mile Island was that Public Service of New Hampshire was allowed to go bankrupt because the Utility Commission in New Hampshire, or not Public Service of New Hampshire was allowed to go bankrupt because the Seabrook cost overruns, and the Utility Commission said you can't keep passing these on. Mm-hmm. And once you had utilities saying, wait, we have to actually be fiscally responsible, they ran away from nuclear. So yes, there is bipartisan support for R&D, but I don't know that my Republican colleagues are yet comfortable or even necessarily have necessarily thought through what it would actually take to deploy nuclear. I mean, Trump is the biggest thing we did to deploy nuclear under the Biden administration was the expansion of the Loan Program Office. Trump is now saying he wants to cut it back.
Right.
I don't know how you build nuclear without something like the Loan Program Office making sure that these next plants will come up on time and on budget.
Did it surprise you that in the coal executive order that came out at the beginning of this week, I think it was the beginning of this week, one of their rationales was to satisfy the demand for data centers, when we've already heard many of the companies like Amazon, Apple, they're already committed to zero carbon energy. And it just seemed like, where did that come from?
I mean, look, this is sort of like saying I'm going to subsidize flying unicorns out of a commitment to mass transit. Right. Like they're words, but they don't actually add up to a logically coherent world.
No.
mean, we could talk about why, but you're too smart for that, Andy. We can move on to other things.
Yeah, let's move on from that. In the green room, I have Kurt Newton, who I know from various conversations that go on about electricity and energy. So let's just bring him in here as a question poser. Kurt, can you just remind folks who you are, what you do, and then pose a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm calling in from Boston, Mass. Professionally, I work at MIT on kind of open knowledge projects, and particularly trying to bring those sort of practices to the most effective forms we can to push climate action. I'm also a huge fan, Sean, of your Representative Caston, of your analogies. Thank you for the unicorn one there. It's great. My question is for the many of us who are kind of retreating, if you will, to a more sort of subnational form of trying to work, for a city, for instance, like Boston. What do you see possibly emerging for new levers that the federal forces might bring to bear on us beyond the sort of traditional modes of like cutting funding and getting in the way of permitting? Are you seeing anything new coming up that we should prepare ourselves for at the subnational level?
I mean, look, what's hard, Kurt, but I think we just have to be honest about this, is that you have a White House where you have a convicted felon in the White House who has been told by the Supreme Court that he is largely immune from actions taken by president. You have John Thune and Mike Johnson saying, we are not going to do any oversight to hold you accountable. And you have Russ Vought running OMB, who says we live in a post-constitutional era, and therefore I don't need to be bound by the Constitution or the laws. Well, if you're not bound by the laws or the Constitution, then all bets are off, right? And, and what we see is a White House right now that is acting with complete impunity. And that's really dangerous. And we could, there is nothing that they could not do if you're not going to do that. I think the challenge that we all have to sort of think through right now, and I'd encourage all of us, is if you are someone who finds yourself thinking that I have too much to lose to stick my head up right now. Maybe you're MIT looking at research grants that you're not going to be able to run if you get through there. Maybe you're a lawyer looking at partners from your firm who will be poached by other firms if you don't change your protocols because you're going to lose a bunch of contracts and have people go after you. Maybe you're a corporation who doesn't want to get the Bud Light treatment. Maybe you are a member of Congress who doesn't want to have the Proud Boys show up outside your house, right? If you are confronted by the fact that if I stand up individually, I could lose everything I care about, you have two choices. Choice one is you cannot stand up. Choice two is you can rally together and stand up collectively and kick them in the ass. And what they want us to do is choose door one. And I think a lot of institutions and elites in our society have chosen door one and empowered the bully to go farther. And bullies do not back down when you give them your lunch money. They come back for more the next day. And so I think, yes, we could talk about how we might, retreat to our corners and protect our little corner of turf and live to fight another day. Or we could recognize that we're all in this together. And our job right now is to leave our grandchildren, not only leave our grandchildren a better world than the one that our grandparents left us, but leave our grandchildren a world where they can say, but for Grandpa, we wouldn't have had this world. And that's the challenge that's before all of us right now.
Yeah, and that's at that very high level we were talking about at the beginning. It's not climate policy. It's just basically ethical form of reacting to oppression and this trend in government.
I mean, to put it in a very climate way, think about how many developers of wind projects, solar projects, geothermal projects, electric vehicle charging stations. Tons of people were deploying tons of money just a few months ago. We were the envy of the rest of the world. I was in Europe meeting with European financial managers who were saying that, we're seeing this flight of capital to the United States. We've turned that around on a dime, right? We've not turned it around because the fundamental investment thesis has changed. We've turned it around out of a fear of alienating Trump, But also, I think because you've got a lot of, the money behind a lot of these deals who are saying, with the IRA in place, with the Biden White House, I can meet my return thresholds. Without that in place, my returns are going to be a little lower, but they're still above zero, right? You could, wouldn't you love to be the person who 4 years from now owns a bunch of assets that are built and operational and ready to capitalize on the fact that for 4 years Trump has been increasing the cost of energy, reducing reliability, and trying to stop you from getting in the market, and all of a sudden you've got the play, right?
Okay.
And I think if you are an investor in the climate space, if you're a developer, getting somebody to have a little bit of patience and a little bit of patriotism is an opportunity, right? And so we all, I mean, that's a very specific way to tie this together, but we all have a role to play.
Yeah, I've heard you say, it made a lot of sense. One of the best things we can do right now is to pick a thing that you can move ahead and succeed with it. To the extent that you are succeeding, that makes it much more robust against forces that might try to block it.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you heard me say it, I've been saying like that was the lesson of the civil rights era, right?
Yeah.
There was no guarantee that the sit-in at Woolworths would work. And they did a lot of other things that didn't work, but when they did the thing that worked, they did it again louder, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you move this ball forward.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to encourage anyone else who wants to ask a question face to face. Here's a way to do that. There's a QR code if you're into that interactive technology, and you could come into the green room. And if you're not civil, as I say, incivility is instant banishment. But I've never had anyone bomb this show before, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, but I will judge you permanently.
And Kurt, actually, I would like to ask Kurt a question. And I'm sure Representative Caston would be interested too. At MIT, you're at the intersection of so many dynamics: financial, technological, academic. What's your vibe right now when you think about the big question of even academic freedom and the future for funding and all that stuff? What's the latest in the scene that you see?
I see a lot of people being really committed to continuing to do the work. For whatever reasons, MIT hasn't quite been hit with some of the things that have come out of other institutions, but I have no reason to expect in particular that'll stay. Mm-hmm. I can't really speak from the institution perspective, of course,
sure.
but I think there's a sense of deep concern and people just being like really committed to staying in the work and trying to not sort of get pulled too far off center from how important it is, the stuff that we got to get doing. I think about what just run at Princeton in their recent attack, that like 3 climate programs were stopped because they were collecting data that was provoking climate anxiety.
I wrote about that a couple of days ago.
Yeah. Representative Caston brings to mind something I heard you say about like, it's as if we're spending too much money on shoes, so let's cut off some of our legs, right? Yeah.
It's surreal. Surreal. And I want to ask about one other aspect of the academic arena, which is international students. I spent time at MIT, and when I was at Columbia, obviously, I've seen a lot of preemptive signs of fear, of all kinds of disquiet, not to mention the role of international students in fostering economic advancement in the states too. Sean Caston, in Illinois, I'm sure you talk to your regions of great, powerful educational institutions too. So maybe from both of you, do you have a sense of this idea of the unit, not just the unitary executive, but the unitary United States, like not engaging with the world, not being a comfortable place for people to come and study, et cetera? How big a deal is that? Maybe Kurt first, and then Representative Caston.
Yeah, it's really a devastating turn of things. The work that so many of us are trying to do in this space relies on global connections and being able to, have people, travel and visit. I really worry about the impact on the incoming student classes for the next few years. It's horrid. There's no way around it.
Yeah. And Representative Keston?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't talked to a single university administrator in Illinois who isn't concerned about that people aren't going to apply. I've had conversations with high school and elementary teachers who, the ESL teacher is telling students where to hide if there's a knock on the door, not knowing, what the status is of the people in the room, but
Wow.
making sure that they have a plan in the same way that you have a plan if a school shooter shows up. And that's, and they're having to go through little drills in the ESL rooms to prepare for that. And what does that do for the trauma? I had, one teacher told me that there was a student who, he never asked his immigration status. He just knew that, he was a native Spanish speaker. And he noticed the student was wearing his jacket to class more often. And he said, "Are you sick? Are you cold?" He said, "No, I just might have to run." Like,
Wow.
I mean, think about the trauma that goes through. There was an exchange, and you could find it. It's on C-SPAN. Jay Powell was before the Financial Services Committee about a month ago. And Vicente Gonzalez from Texas pointed out to him that in the last time he was before the Financial Services Committee, we were looking at Fed data, and the Congressional Budget Office had essentially shown this even much more strongly, that the primary reason why the United States was adding so many jobs and was seeing inflation come down was because immigration was running so much hotter than we'd expected. And so Congressman Gonzalez said, should we expect the Trump curtailment of immigration to accelerate inflation? And Powell, in his very Fed chair way, said, we're not worried about the lower workforce leading to higher inflation because we're also seeing reductions in new job starts. Thank you, Donald Trump, for causing our economy to stop adding jobs at the same time that immigration is going down. Now, I'll give you an optimistic part. And here in Illinois, we don't, as Democrats, we don't always praise him, but, go read Ronald Reagan's farewell speech. I've always seen America as a great shining city on the hill, and if that city must have walls, make sure it has doors and windows so that all can come inside. Right?
Yeah.
Or when he said that the day America stops welcoming immigrants to our shores is the day we stop being Americans. There is a heart and the soul in the Republican Party that once celebrated a man who knew that Russia was the bad guys.
Right.
Knew that immigration was the way that we constantly refresh our country.
Yeah, I was tweeting Reagan's one of his radio addresses, a regular one he did on tariffs, where he expressly rejected tariffs unless they were very targeted and precise and careful, like the one he did with Japan. I listened to that speech, and I listened to the current GOP, and same thing. I kind of.
Yeah, it was funny. I was actually walking off the floor with Nancy Pelosi earlier this week, and we were talking about some of those Reagan speeches. And she looked at me and she said, he was so good on Russia and so good on immigration. And I was like, yeah, it was horrible on civil rights, though. And she was like, oh, yeah, when he was our governor, like we had a lot of problems with him there. Yeah. I guess we all contain multitudes.
Well, we do. But that's where you could theoretically find some crosstalk, some points of engagement and constructive congressional dynamic. It just feels stifled so completely. This is not a new issue by Trumpism that it seems hard to break forward. I want to shift gears to a couple of specific things that you've made highlighted on recently, and this relates enough to Kurt that maybe we'll keep Kurt. You can stay on a little longer. On your website, you're amid all the turmoil, amid all these high level paralytic and dangerous trends, you still are pursuing some pretty specific policies in the sort of the climate space. I saw cap and trade, and frankly, I was surprised because that feels so 20th century in some ways. But obviously, in the perfect world, that's the kind of way you could foster accelerated transition. So, just talk through a few of these ideas that you're pushing amid everything.
Well, so let me do the cap and trade one just because I'm really fond of this one, and it picks up our theme about Reagan. The Republican Party invented cap and trade. It was I mean, you remember, Andy, when we were concerned we were going to lose all of our sugar maples. Actually, even before that, I think it was the ozone hole, right, which led to the Montreal Protocol, and the
Yeah.
idea that we could use markets as tools to solve problems, and it worked, right? We don't worry about the ozone hole like we used to back in the 80s. And then we were concerned about the acid rain from all those power plants in the Midwest, dropping it on New England. And you remember when that acid rain trading program came out, I think the initial estimates was it was going to cost $500 a ton, and within a year it was less than $5 a ton because markets had figured out ways to solve that. And so what we've done is basically take that approach to emissions pricing and to create a cap and trade bill where instead of giving an allowance based on last year's emissions, you get an allowance based on how many megawatt hours of power you generate in the calendar year, or how many BTUs you make of useful energy. We've got a couple different industries in there. And so you will never have an over allowance, but we will ratchet down the allowance per megawatt hour per ton so that you drive that to zero, but so that all of the trading happens upstream of the consumer. So if you're a coal plant and you're in a position where you have to buy 800 pounds per megawatt hour, and I'm a solar panel and I have 800 pounds a megawatt hour that's available to sell, the two of us can sell. I now have whatever you paid me, lowering my cost per megawatt hour. Your cost per the same megawatt hour went up by an equivalent amount. And we can get into a price elasticity, but the overall cost structure of the industry hasn't changed. And it's essentially the mechanism that, we can give the Reagan administration credit, but I think it's really Bill Ruckelshaus and Bill Riley and the Bush administrations who put those programs together. Bill Ruckelshaus, of course, has passed. Bill Riley has become a good friend. And this was basically saying, how do we take that, what was once upon a time a very Republican idea about using market forces to address pollution, and make that work for CO2. And this is it's modified a fair amount from prior terms, but this is the third term that we've introduced this bill. And someday that door is going to open again, and we just want to be there when it does.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask. There's a long journey for legislation quite often. So this is your glide slope toward something post-Trump.
Yeah, and well, it's post-Trump, but we got to get the Democratic Party to do better on this. We've had terms, half of the time I've been in Congress, the Democrats have been the majority. I don't think we have even had a hearing on carbon pricing in any form in at least a dozen years.
Wow.
Shame on us. They just, I remember saying when I first came into Congress that, we have a PhD level problem. The Democrats are at a sixth grade reading level, and the Republicans are debating whether or not it's worth going to school. And we need to not judge ourselves by whether we are better than the Republicans on this. We need to judge ourselves by, have we closed the gap between what's scientifically necessary and what's politically possible? Because as long as that gap exists, we're failing at our job as politicians.
Right. Kurt, when you think about the policy scales here, anything come to mind from the standpoint of the kinds of things you work on?
Yeah. I spend a bunch of time facilitating events with this amazing En-ROADS climate simulator, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we've one of those. Appreciate them.
One of the most powerful messages has to do with the value, if we will, of carbon pricing. You just kind of can't get away from it at the end of the day. If we're serious people, it's got to be part of the mix. I'm also going to call out the proposed cuts to EPA. Just the conceptual flip of it's not about protecting anymore. I just still can't get my head around.
I believe the term of art, Kurt, is defund the police.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's interesting in the context of things now. So you have some other things here, including on energy efficiency. Can you just sort of sketch out what you're thinking of there too?
Uh, you're gonna stump me because I have to remember what exactly what we did there, and I forget off the top of my
That's okay.
head.
I'll bring up an angle that drives me
Okay.
crazy, and this is aimed at Democrats to a certain amount as well. In Biden time, two or so years ago, they launched heat.gov, which was a online resource, everything you needed to track around heat vulnerability around the country, sort of real time data. And I hailed it, but I said, I also, in my post on my blog on this Sustain What, I said, where's cold.gov? Because there are many people in America whose health and well-being are just as much a function of, are reduced, threatened as much by cold as they are by heat, and often in the same cities. Chicago, Detroit, you can have terrible heat. Chicago had the great heat wave of 1990,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and it turns out I was looking at the data, and there was some really interesting research by some University of Michigan and Michigan State health scientists that found, guess what? The things you would want to do for both of those are the same, basically the same. So
Mm,
yeah, you can have a single policy on something like weatherization of
mm.
low income housing, and you're constraining both ends of the spectrum of climate vulnerability, and it's not, and then it's not a climate change thing. It's not a
Yeah,
global warming thing, and I think there are arguments to be made about sort of vulnerability reduction that could pass the test more easily in our divided politics.
yeah. I think broadly speaking, uh, the the challenge to decarbonization is purely about capital deployment. You know, in the words of Jigger Shaw, deploy, deploy, deploy. The challenge that fossil fuel has is that if we deploy the clean stuff, they need subsidies just to keep operating, right? And so if you look at the subsidies we have in the system, we provide huge tax subsidies to oil wells as long as they operate, so that they keep getting money for producing. But all you need to do on the front end is lower the cost, because we can make, and to your point about low income homes, the if you can afford to put more insulation in your home and put a heat pump in and put in your triple pane windows, you're going to have a lot of money in your pocket down the road, and so will future owners of your house, because they don't have to spend as much on energy. On the other hand, if you can't afford to put that stuff in the first place, you're paying a lot more to your local electric gas utility, right? And so anything we do to lower that initial barrier, and I think if you look broadly at the way we subsidize clean energy and dirty energy in this country, because we do subsidize both.
Yeah.
On the clean energy side, we're lowering the purchase price. On the dirty energy side, we're subsidizing the operating cost. And within there's this enormous opportunity that we could make a ton of money. I think you and I may have talked about this last time. If you divide U.S. GDP by U.S. primary energy use, we generate a little bit over $200 at GDP for every million BTUs of primary energy we use. The UK generates almost $400 at GDP per MMBTU. The Danes generate a little over 500. The Swiss are at 600. These are all first world economies. Now, maybe throw out the Swiss, because their economy, depends on a lot of stuff that doesn't use energy, like, banking and all sorts of other stuff. But the Danes, the Brits, well,
Yeah.
that means that, like, if we just deployed the capital, we could have twice as big an economy with the same amount of energy use. Or if you prefer, the same size economy with only half the energy use, which means we've all got a lot more money in our pocket, unless you are an energy producer.
Yep.
Right? And the good news is there's a lot more energy consumers than there are energy producers in this country.
There you go. That's an issue and an opportunity we should probably dig in on more in a future conversation. It seems that dynamic you just described and the difference between the different countries is really revelatory.
I had, just as context on that, when we shortly after the IRA was passed, we were at the COP in Sharm el Sheikh, and President Sisi of Egypt was giving us a hard time, saying that because of the IRA, money was being sucked out of the developing world and flowing to the United States. And we were all, of course, very happy to hear that. But he said, you've got to make sure that we continue to have money for this green transition. And I said to him, we're not going to stop encouraging U.S. businesses, but if you stop subsidizing oil and gas production in your country, you would also bring more capital in. And he said, if I stopped doing that, I'd have lots of unemployed young men, and if you heard of the Muslim Brotherhood, there'd be a risk of terrorism.
Right.
And I came back and I said to some of my Republican colleagues on the Gulf Coast, I understand the dilemma you're in now, right? Like we in this country have some very recent experience with the political troubles that are created when you have large numbers of unemployed young men.
There's one question I know you got to cut out before the end of the hour for sure. So Stephen Filler asked about something I'm not familiar with. Is there an appetite for any Republicans on the Hill, to support the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? I know they've been helpful with CDFIs. This is outside of my...
I don't know. I mean, if you look at I'm actually trying to get some better data. We were recently getting a presentation on all the pieces of the IRA by the size of the program and the climate benefit that it has, and both mattered because you've got Republicans who are saying, and I think, Kurt, this was the analogy I made about, cut off your leg to save money on shoes. Decided they have to give $4.5 trillion of tax cuts to Elon Musk and 12 other billionaires, and therefore we have to cut a bunch of other expense out of the economies. They're looking at the size it is.
Right.
And there are, among the pieces of the IRA that are both very impactful and very attractive as targets to the Republicans are most of the EV incentives, because they're high dollar, but they're also high greenhouse gas savings. If I remember right, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was a little bit under the radar because it was smaller. My request for data that I haven't gotten back yet is that's a bit of a one-hand clapping exercise because we're only looking at the size of because if we can bring clean energy forward with a 10% investment tax credit or a 30% investment tax credit, the 10% investment tax credit levers 3 times as many private dollars, and all else equal has 3 times the climate impact, but we don't look at that when we only look at the federal dollars. And I think the single biggest bang for the buck we had in the IRA was probably the Loan Program Office, because that was a fairly small credit subsidy to provide low interest loans that don't cost the government, outside of the occasional default, don't cost the government money. So it shows up as a tiny little cost, but that brought forward almost like $380 billion. Like the amount of money that the Loan Program Office brought forward was as big as the total federal outlay for all the other programs. So I don't mean to avoid Stephen's question here, but I think as far as thinking about how to prioritize things we should be pushing for, we should look at the total scale, not the outlay. What is hard is that there is, at least if you look at some of the Republican statements, they're broadly supportive of a number of the clean energy credits in the IRA. You've seen this letter from 15 or 20 Republicans saying that they want to protect the credits that are coming to their state, which are some of the solar, wind, ITC, certainly the manufacturing tax credits. I think you have to watch their feet and ignore their lips on this one, because we're 48 hours ago, we were hearing that a whole bunch of Republicans said they would never sign off on the Senate funding bill because it was fiscally disastrous. And then Donald Trump twisted their arm, and they all folded like Montgomery chairs. So I think we need to see if they will stand and fight when it matters. But if you take their words, there's a number of them who claim that when the moment comes, they will be big boys. Okay.
Yes, when the moment comes, and something will happen for sure, one way or the other. In the meantime, though, of course, the Trump EPA is calling this all a big the same fund, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, to them is even to go to the EPA.gov website and see this kind of announcement. I don't know what it does for you. What does it?
Well,
I don't want to end on a negative note. Maybe one quick thought on this, and let's go to some closing thoughts from you, Sean Caston.
I was just going to say, in the first Trump administration, because I've been on the Financial Services Committee, Kathy Kraninger, who at the time was the head of the Consumer Protection Financial Board, we asked her, what is the mission of the Consumer Protection Financial Board? And she categorically refused to say that it was exclusively to protect consumers. We now have the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who is categorically refusing to say that his mission is to protect the environment.
Wow. So it's a Friday. It's the end of the day, the end of a week, yet another tumultuous week. So just a last thought from you on how your constituents and the rest of us can find a strategy for moving forward.
The single most important thing for all of us to do is to stand up, be courageous, and be loud. There is a huge hunger in America to see people doing something and succeeding. That I don't think it's coincidental that the energy of those protests last week came shortly on the heels of some really positive election results in Wisconsin. We can talk about strategy, we can talk about all the things that we might have done different in the past, but the only thing that matters is the future. And I think the encouragement and the hope that I've found is that every time we've done something loud and courageous, people have come and thanked us for us afterwards and said it gave them a little bit more hope. Some of that's on the climate front, some of that's on the economic front, some of that's on the political front. A crazy one when we forced a vote on the floor to release Matt Gaetz' ethics report, I had 4 Republicans who voted against it, who came up to me and thanked me for doing it. They said, politically, I couldn't vote yes, but we need to keep the pressure up, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And, there's a very cynical take you could do on that, but the positive take is, all right, I got him infected with courage. The disease didn't stick yet, but we got the germs in their system now, right? So I think all of us just go out and do that, and that's how we're going to get through this.
That's great. Well, it's great that you've been able to spend some time this afternoon talking to us about this, and I'd like to think we can check in further as things move on. This idea of finding your actionable space, whatever your skill set is very important as well. Going to the protests is one way to be visible. Another one is to, whether you're a teacher, an artist, a blogger, or just a voter, and so you can find these layers can be attacked in different ways, in different perspectives, and in different scales. And it seems to be a way to keep sane and feel better. And Kurt Newton, with the work you're doing at MIT and everywhere else, same thing to you. Thanks for being on today. And I'd like to get you and some of the other electricity gang on some shows going forward. And thanks to anyone watching. This will be available as soon as we're done on all the different platforms. You can look at that scrolling bar at the bottom and find ways to get in touch with me for future shows. And wherever you are, stay sane, take a breath, and find a way to reach out to someone with a slightly different perspective and talk about one thing that lies within your overlapping worlds and work on it. Thanks, everybody.
Well,
and we'll do this again. This is Andy Revkin. Sustain what? Hold on.